So, marathon amount of videos for me to make because I left everything to the last minute. I didn't really leave stuff to the last minute. I've been quite busy getting some other things done for your class and some of my other classes. And that's why I haven't uploaded videos on a more consistent basis. But now, hopefully, we'll be caught up, right? Caught up. Because we're going to look at head and neck organization and development. So for this video, I'm going to do a couple things. So for starters, I didn't really know what to make for this video because, excuse me, we went through concepts that I don't necessarily draw out as much in my classes. And what I really wanted to do was put a whole bunch of muscle stuff on previous videos. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to review head and neck development, the stuff that we've already covered, and just talk a little bit about it while I maybe draw and label a couple things out. And then I'm going to go over gut tube structures and functions, including like what is the process for deglutition, which is also known as swallowing. And I didn't put any of those muscles on this so that you guys go back and look at those muscles again on the other YouTube videos. And lastly, we'll look at respiratory structures. I didn't put blood vessels on here because I did those blood vessels in like the blood vessels for the brain. So you can go look at those blood vessels in the neck so you understand those. And I'm not going to go over too much development, but I'll go through that. So that last part will be what are the respiratory structures in the neck here? And hopefully that'll bring everything together, especially with the muscles of the neck for swallowing. So I'm going to start development in a way that was taught previously in this class, even by me, which is how to draw an embryo's head. You don't have to draw it. I gave you the drawing, but you want to understand that the body in general and the head is dominated by two tubes. So those two tubes are, remember, the dorsal hollow nerve tube here in the back. Made from neural ectoderm. It's all going to come back full circle one more time. In the cranial region, this becomes the brain. So this area here becomes the brain. It is actually split into three partitions, which is the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Wow, just like foregut, midgut, hindgut. And then forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain become specific parts of the brain. It's a little less important for you guys to know that. But you do want to understand a couple of key concepts. One of those key concepts is the brain has to be encased in the skull. Okay. And the skull is going to be made both endochondrally and intramembranously. So as we've seen before, right, we're going to have at the bottom here, where the bottom of the brain is, the inferior portion of the skull is going to start to develop from cartilage. So here you'll have hyaline cartilage. And that hyaline cartilage is going to create bones in the occipital bone, part of the temporal bone, a little bit of the sphenoid bone. And that's going to help to make sure that as the brain starts to grow, it has something as a base to grow on top of. So it doesn't just smush the whole tube as it gets bigger and bigger. And then covering the brain, encasing the brain on the outside layer, that's going to be membrane. So this is going to be embryonic membrane. This is really called mesenchyme, as I've said previously. So mesenchyme can become anything. In this case, it becomes osteoblasts, and those osteoblasts start to form the bones that go around the growing brain. And this is going to cause a couple of things to happen for the brain. The brain is now growing in a space, like a very small-ish space. It's going to expand, but it's not going to expand greatly. So what that means is the brain has to figure out how to get bigger in the limited amount of space that it has. So it's going to do that in two ways. One way is that it's going to start to grow more posterior and lateral, and it does this and it bends. So when it bends, essentially the forebrain starts to get larger, and it causes the midbrain and the hindbrain to basically become, it's still going to be towards the like the bottom portion and the inferior portion, but the forebrain actually is going to encompass or encase, so basically surround the midbrain and the hindbrain. And midbrain and hindbrain basically create the diencephalon and the brain stem. So this causes the cerebellum, I'm sorry, the cerebrum to cover the diencephalon. Let me rewrite that right there. And the brainstem. And then the second thing that's going to happen is you're still in limited space. So as the cerebrum and the cerebellum get bigger and bigger, they can't expand too much, but they need a lot of surface area for that processing power. So what happens is the cortex starts to dip inward. So if you had the cortex that was flat like this, it starts to dip inward and then it comes back outward and dips inward and it comes back outward like that. And this is going to create the wrinkly pattern, so the bumps and the grooves that we see. On the surface of the cerebrum and the cerebellum, increasing surface area. So we see increased surface area. Really think about more area for cell bodies of the neuron. The other great tube that we're going to see, which is here in green, this is the gut tube. And in the cranial portion of the gut tube, we're going to create the mouth and this area here, which is going to be the pharynx, which is then going to lead towards this part, which is the esophagus. Okay. So the pharynx, surrounding it, what these circles represent are the pharyngeal pouches. Sometimes they're known as slits, sometimes they're known as pouches. Trust me, it was a big problem over several years of teaching this, like what do we call these things? Because they have like 3 or 4 different names. So just standardize it and call it the pharyngeal pouches. Okay. I don't even like gill slits because that's not like it's not a real term. And then they're also called visceral arches, whatever. They're basically these outgrowths in the neck area. Okay. They did in primitive chordates, they had a slit that went through them and they created the gills. In more advanced chordates like humans, they don't create gills, they're going to create other structures. So you want to think about like you actually had, 3, 4, 5-ish pouches that came out. And those 5 pouches that came out would have mesoderm, they had endoderm, they had ectoderm, they had neural crest. But essentially, they always created some type of a bone or cartilage structure. They would always have an artery associated with them. They would have a muscle associated with them, which is unfortunate that I don't have more colors, but we'll do that as they had, I'm sorry, a cranial nerve. And then muscle we'll just make purple because why not? So most of the head and the neck structures are made from these pharyngeal pouches. Like the mandible is made from that, and then part of the inner ear is made from that. Your facial expression muscles, your chewing muscles, all of those are actually made by pharyngeal slits. So if you remember the rectus series, these muscles in the neck here, and that included geniohyoid and genioglossus, but it didn't include mylohyoid or digastric. That's because anything innervated by a cranial nerve is actually from a pharyngeal slit instead. So even trapezius, sternocleidomastoid, are technically supposed to be from pharyngeal slits, but it's kind of that I question is kind of weird. Okay. So it's not important to know specifically which pharyngeal pouch or slit makes which thing, but you might see these arches. Sometimes they're called arches. Again, in 2240, when we look at like blood vessel structure in the chest area and the neck area, it's like it's not symmetrical here. But anyway, so you're going to have the mouth and you're going to have the pharynx. And then the other thing that is important here is that what we're going to see is that budding from the gut tube anterior to the gut tube, you're going to start to have lung buds right here. And they're going to be pulled all the way down, creating the lungs that will be in the chest. But then we're going to see that these pharyngeal slits make some of the cartilage structures that actually become part of the airway as well. And that the respiratory system is actually made from endoderm from the pharynx. And we're going to see that the respiratory system is going to be anterior or ventral to the pharynx, which is back behind. Okay, and I think actually should probably, the lung buds probably come down a little bit lower, but it's not important that you know specifically where these came from, like what specific area. This is like my overview of the development of the head and the neck structures. The things you want to think about most is like what's happening to the brain and the skull going around it, and then what's happening to the gut tube, how the respiratory system is budding off ventrally to that. And you see that the mouth is continuous with the pharynx, which is continuous with the esophagus. Because then we're going to look at adult structures of those areas.